The morning air in Flaxborough carried the faint, lingering scent of damp cobbles and brewing tea, the sort of aroma that suggested nothing more exciting than another day of municipal routine. Miss Edwina Potts, proprietress of the Lilac Teashop, arranged her porcelain cups with meticulous care, humming an old ballad that seemed to wobble between optimism and melancholy. Outside the market square had begun its gentle stir, Mr. Fisk polishing his brass-handled stall, Mrs. Tremlett fussing over a basket of overripe apples, and the occasional cyclist rattling past with a jaunty bell. The tea shop was an oasis of order and civility, with gingham curtains shielding the outside world and a discreet bell above the door that announced arrivals with genteel restraint. It was here, amid the clatter of teaspoons and the soft sighs of elderly ladies debating the merits of Darjeeling versus Assam, that the first peculiar incident occurred, a minor disturbance that would, in time, become central to the quiet upheaval of the town. Miss Potts had just poured a particularly generous pot of Earl Grey for Mrs. Redding, the widow of a retired bank clerk, when a man entered who seemed, at least to the casual observer, slightly out of place. He wore a well-cut grey overcoat, polished shoes, and an expression that hinted at someone used to being waited upon rather than serving. He glanced around the room, adjusted his spectacles, and then, as if in sudden alarm, leaned forward over the counter and dropped a small object with a clatter that turned every eye. It was a silver locket, delicate and slightly tarnished, sliding across the polished counter toward Miss Potts. She leaned forward, gently lifting it between thumb and forefinger. "Oh my," she said, the words laced with the perfect measure of curiosity and faint disapproval. "And whose might this be?" The gentleman, reddening, cleared his throat. "I fear I dropped it," he murmured, eyes darting nervously between the tea-shop patrons. There was an unusual tension in his posture, something slightly theatrical yet restrained, as though he had rehearsed this moment and was now failing to remember the lines. Mrs. Redding, ever eager to involve herself in small mysteries, peered over the rim of her cup. "That looks very valuable," she whispered, a touch too loudly. "Are you quite certain it belongs to you?" The man hesitated. "Yes." Quiet. "It was a gift. Many years ago." His gaze flickered toward the doorway, as if expecting someone or perhaps fearing someone might follow. A small shiver ran down the spine of Miss Potts, though she did not know why. There was something uncomfortably calculated in the way he handled the locket, something that suggested its importance far outweighed the usual domestic sentiments of silver trinkets. And then, with astonishing suddenness, he collapsed forward. The teacups teetered perilously. Mrs. Tremlett shrieked, clutching her apples. A spoon clattered to the floor. Miss Potts froze, teapot in hand, teapot in, as the man lay prone on the checkered linoleum, a delicate hand still gripping the locket. No one moved immediately. The sort of pause that follows something wholly unexpected settled over the tea shop. A few patrons whispered, trying to divine whether this was fainting, a prank, or, heaven forbid, something more serious. Only the quiet, polite ticking of the wall clock continued, heedless of human disorder. Miss Potts, having regained a semblance of composure, knelt beside him. "Sir? Sir, are you—" There was no response, not a flutter of eyelid, not a twitch of a finger. Mrs. Redding clutched the edge of her chair, muttering prayers for the unfortunate man's survival, while Mrs. Tremlett's apron shook as though she were convulsed with suppressed panic. By the time the local constable, P.C. Harris, arrived, summoned by an urgent, flustered phone call from Miss Potts, the scene had begun to attract the first ripples of town gossip. Neighbours peered through the windows, and a small crowd had gathered, muttering conjectures about overexertion, sudden illness, or perhaps ever so delicately a case of foul play. P.C. Harris, a man of dutiful composure but limited imagination, knelt beside the figure. His brow furrowed as he felt for a pulse. "Blimey," he murmured, and Miss Potts caught the slight catch of disbelief in his voice. "He's gone, ma'am. I don't think there's any mistake. He's dead." The words were met with polite gasps and murmurs, as if the tea shop itself had been quietly informed of some domestic tragedy rather than a dramatic catastrophe. Miss Potts, recovering her calm with remarkable alacrity, adjusted her apron and stood, eyeing the silver locket now resting on the counter. Its delicate chain caught the morning light, glinting with a subtle insistence that made her stomach tighten, not from fear, but from that indefinable sense that the orderly rhythm of Flaxborough had been, in a single moment, irreversibly disrupted. It was the sort of minor yet shocking occurrence that in Flaxborough would be dissected over countless cups of tea, whispered about behind lace curtains, and eventually scrutinized by one patient, quietly observant man, Inspector Purbright. And though the townsfolk did not yet know it, this seemingly trivial death at a tea shop counter would prove to be the first thread in a tapestry of secrets, half-truths, and understated malice woven into the very fabric of their daily lives. By mid-morning, the lilac tea shop had become, in the quietest possible sense, the centre of Flaxborough's collective attention. Not in a clamorous or dramatic way, of course there was no shouting or police tape, no blaring headlines, but in that subtle, insistent manner peculiar to small towns where news is whispered over sugar bowls and rearranged endlessly in the retelling until the truth is less relevant than the flavour it acquires. Mrs. Tremlett, still clutching her basket of bruised apples as though they were talismans, against the chaos she had witnessed, had taken it upon herself to circulate the first account. "A man, you see," she told Mrs. Pargeter, over the garden gate by 10 o'clock, collapsed right at the counter. Right in front of Miss Potts, of all people. Imagine. And with a silver locket, I believe it slipped from his hand. Such a curious object, too. So delicate. Why would anyone carry such a thing at this hour of the day? Her voice carried a note of conspiracy, though it was merely amplified by fascination. Within the hour, the story had evolved through a dozen households. In one version, the man had swooned from sheer embarrassment upon misplacing a precious family heirloom. In another, he had been the victim of some subtle poison, perhaps slipped into the Earl Grey while no one was looking. Yet another suggested he was a foreign spy, gathering intelligence in the guise of a gentleman seeking tea. The townsfolk naturally accepted the embellishments with polite nods, for in Flaxborough reality was rarely more interesting than conjecture. Meanwhile, Miss Potts herself, unaccustomed to being at the centre of what could loosely be termed a scandal, busied herself with restoring the tea shop to its usual order. She rearranged cups, wiped the counter, and even set the small silver locket neatly atop the cash register, though she did so with a furtive glance, as though it might vanish if left in too casual a position. Her hands trembled only slightly. The town had a habit of exaggerating, and she preferred not to give it unnecessary fuel. P.C. Harris, the constable, attempted to maintain an official presence, which in Flaxborough meant he shuffled between the tea shop, the market square, and the neighbouring high street, nodding at anyone who might have overheard or witnessed anything at all. "Keep calm," he advised with the sort of firmness that suggested both authority and uncertainty. "We'll have Inspector Purbright in shortly. Until then, please, no speculation," he added quietly, almost to himself. "Though I expect there will be plenty." It was a matter of some relief, therefore, when Purbright arrived. He entered unobtrusively, noting at once the quiet tension, the way Miss Potts's apron was creased in the wrong places, the faint smudge of dirt on the counter where a teacup had fallen, the whispering groups in the corner who paused mid-gossip as he passed. He nodded politely to each of them in turn, his manner suggesting both deference and quiet authority. "Morning, Miss Potts," he said, voice measured, almost conversational. "I trust the day finds you as well as it can under the circumstances?" "Oh, Inspector," Miss Potts replied, smoothing her hands over the counter with a nervous precision. "Well enough. Thank you, though I dare say the town may never forgive me for letting such a thing happen right under my nose." Purbright's eyes swept the room with casual attention. "Tell me exactly what happened," he said, drawing no particular urgency into his tone, as if it were merely a curiosity rather than the announcement of sudden death. She complied, describing in precise detail the entrance of the man, the locket, the small clatter as it struck the counter, and then the collapse. She emphasized nothing, and yet, in the selection of minor details, revealed more than she knew. The exact trajectory of the locket, the slight hesitation of the man before he fell, the precise order in which the teacups trembled each fragment that Purbright filed carefully away. "Did anyone touch the locket?" he asked, tilting his head. "Not that I know of," she replied. "I merely picked it up to prevent it from rolling onto the floor." She hesitated, though Mrs. Redding did lean forward to peer at it quite closely. "She's terribly curious." Purbright made a quiet note, not in ink, but in the subtle ledger of his mind, elderly widow, curiosity bordering on meddling, perhaps relevant, perhaps merely colourful. "And did the gentleman speak after collapsing?" he inquired. "No," she said. "He never moved, not a sound. I thought perhaps he'd fainted, but—" Her voice trailed, a faint quiver betraying that even she sensed the finality, though she had not yet admitted it outright. He moved on to Mrs. Tremlett, who had taken refuge by the window, cradled the apple basket as though it were a child. "Mrs. Tremlett, can you describe what you saw?" "Oh, Inspector," she began breathlessly, "it was the most dreadful thing." He simply fell. "And that locket?" "It slid across the counter and well, nearly dropped my apples in fright." And everyone gasped, even Miss Potts, though she tried so hard to remain calm. "One might think it a fainting fit, but—" "Oh, it was more than that." She fluttered her hands, scattering imaginary details in the air. So sudden, so decisive. Purbright nodded with gentle patience, filing away the small tremors in her story, the slight exaggerations, the emphasis she deemed crucial. Then he stepped back, observing the room from a quiet distance. He noticed how the morning light glinted off the polished locket, how a faint scent of Earl Grey mingled with a lingering metallic tang of something else, an undercurrent of anxiety that, though intangible, was perceptible to a man accustomed to reading subtle atmospheres. By noon, the entire town was subtly aware of the event, though not all had witnessed it first-hand. Shopkeepers discussed the incident over counters, postmen mentioned it in passing, and the church bells tolled in a manner entirely unrelated, yet somehow contributing to the sense of something amiss. Rumours flourished, each new teller adding colour, shading, or moral judgment. The man was a jeweller's agent. He had come to discuss a clandestine transaction. He was an estranged relative seeking reconciliation. He had enemies, no doubt, lurking in the quiet corners of the market square. Amid the murmurs, one fact remained consistent. He had collapsed at the tea-shop counter, clutching the silver locket. Every other detail became suspect, malleable, subject to embellishment. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had completed his preliminary walk-through. He had noted the placement of chairs, the trajectory of the locket, the angle at which the man had fallen. He had asked no leading questions, allowed no assumptions to pass as truth, and yet he had begun to perceive the faint outlines of a narrative invisible to the casual observer. "Miss Potts," he said finally, as the last of the patrons drifted back into the market square, "I shall require the names of everyone who was present at the time." and perhaps a list of those who might have reason to take interest in this gentleman or the locket. His tone was soft, unhurried, almost conversational, yet the precision of his words carried an undeniable gravity. "Yes, Inspector," she replied, bowing her head slightly. "I can prepare that for you at once." As he stepped into the afternoon light, the town continued its quiet agitation. Flaxborough was a place where news travelled like smoke through the chimneys, diffuse, subtle, and never entirely controllable. Already, in whispered corners, the first insinuations had taken root. The gentleman had been involved in some secret affair, perhaps a scandal, perhaps a crime, perhaps merely an unfortunate misadventure. Purbright walked calmly toward his car, observing the market stalls with their measured clutter, the shop windows reflecting the mid-afternoon sun, the occasional passer-by glancing up with curiosity and concern. He noted each detail with the patience of a man who understood that in a town such as this the truth is never immediate, never loud. It is rather the product of careful listening, quiet observation, and the gentle peeling away of pretense, an operation requiring as much tact as insight. And as he drove slowly toward the police station, he allowed himself a small, private reflection. Flaxborough, in all its polite orderliness, had been nudged, not violently, not dramatically, but just enough to reveal the delicate tensions, petty resentments, and carefully guarded secrets that lay beneath its genteel surface. It would take time, perhaps weeks, to unravel them, and the town would be all the more agitated for it. But Inspector Purbright, as always, was in no hurry. His mind, composed and deliberate, already began to catalogue suspects, motives, and the subtle contradictions that would eventually lead him to the truth hidden beneath the Teashop's quiet, sunlit counter. The morning following the incident, Inspector Purbright was seated in his office at the Flaxborough police station, a small room furnished with more papers than chairs and a single window that overlooked the slowly stirring market square. He sipped from a cup of tea, the liquid calm and unremarkable, yet its warmth lent him a measure of composure as he considered the events of the previous day. Outside, the town moved with its usual rhythm, seemingly indifferent to the death that had occurred at the Lilac Teashop, yet subtly altered in its tempo, as if the town itself had inhaled a different air and now breathed cautiously, uncertain of what might follow. Purbright had already begun compiling his list of those present at the Teashop, noting the intricacies of small-town relationships that might otherwise seem inconsequential. Miss Potts, naturally, had been first to provide her account, precise and measured, though she could not entirely conceal the faint tremor that lingered in her voice whenever she mentioned the locket. Mrs. Tremlett and Mrs. Redding were next, each bringing with them a personality-infused version of events, embroidered in ways that revealed more about their own concerns than about the deceased gentleman. Yet it was in these minor exaggerations and the subtle contradictions they produced that Purbright found the most valuable clues. He summoned P.C. Harris to assist with preliminary interviews, not as a matter of urgency, but as an exercise in patient observation. Harris, who could be relied upon to transcribe facts accurately, if not insightfully, appeared relieved to be of some purpose. "Sir," he began, clearing his throat, "I've been going through the names Miss Potts gave us. Quite a list, though not particularly distinguished by scandal." Purbright allowed a quiet smile. Scandal, as he knew, rarely announced itself. It hid in plain sight, waiting for the correct angle of observation. Their first visit was to Mr. Fisk, the brass-handled stall owner, who had arrived early each morning for 40 years, polishing his wares with an almost ceremonial dedication. He greeted them with a nod, polishing the rag, poised. "Inspector," he said, voice smooth and formal, "a pleasure, though I can hardly think why my observations would be of import. I arrived shortly after the event, you see." I merely noticed the crowd gathered, whispers exchanged. Curious, yes, but hardly noteworthy. Purbright inclined his head politely. And yet you did notice, Mr. Fisk. Tell me exactly what you observed every movement, no matter how trivial. Fisk hesitated, glancing at his stall as if the brass handles themselves might betray his honesty. Well, the gentleman he was, unsettled, perhaps? A twitch of the hand, as he adjusted his spectacles. He glanced toward the door more than once. Then he collapsed. That is all I saw. Did you notice anything unusual about his appearance or manner? Purbright prompted softly. Fisk considered this carefully. Unusual? Only that he seemed on edge, a touch impatient. Not a resident, certainly. One does not carry oneself so in Flaxborough unless one is accustomed to strangers observing every move. Purbright nodded, filing the observation silently. There was a measured anxiety in the stranger's posture, subtle and restrained, the sort of thing only perceptible to a patient eye. It was not fear, not outright agitation, but the kind of precision that suggested a man accustomed to concealment. Next came Mrs. Redding, who invited them into her parlour with the faintly dramatic flourish of a woman who considered herself a steward of propriety and moral judgment. "Inspector," she began, "I must insist that you understand the gravity of what I witnessed." He was clutching the locket, yes, but there was a hesitation, a manner of glancing about, as though expecting someone or fearing someone might arrive. And that locket. She held up a hand, fingers trembling, though no locket appeared. Such craftsmanship, delicate and personal. One does not misplace such a thing accidentally. "Did you notice anyone near him at the time?" Purbright asked gently, masking the thread of his reasoning. Mrs. Redding pursed her lips, merely the usual ladies Miss Potts, Mrs. Tremlett, but it was in their silence that the atmosphere became charged, one might say, anticipatory. He allowed a slight pause, letting the words sink into his own quiet ledger of observations. Anticipatory. Not ordinary, that. A clue of motive, or merely a reflection of communal curiosity? He would need more. Mrs. Tremlett, for her part, recounted the event with the flourish of theatricality. "Inspector, I nearly fainted, I assure you." "And the apples!" The poor apples nearly went flying. One never expects death or anything resembling it over morning tea. And yet there it was, so sudden, so absolute. Her eyes widened, and Purbright noted the unconscious emphasis on finality. "But you see, he was clutching the locket, and it shone, sir. I cannot explain it, but it shone." Purbright made no comment, observing only. There was in all three accounts a subtle pattern emerging, attention to detail heightened by personal interpretation, the human tendency to amplify significance while concealing uncertainty. By early afternoon, Purbright visited the man's lodgings, a modest room above a draper's shop on the High Street. The landlady, Mrs. Calvert, greeted him with a faint alarm at the official visit. "Oh, Inspector, you're not here about Mr. Langley, are you? He was so particular about his routine. Every morning the same tea, the same walk to the square. Mr. Langley, you say?" Purbright inquired, noting the name in the margins of his mental ledger. "Yes," Mrs. Calvert said, wringing her hands. "A quiet gentleman, polite, punctual, and, well, reserved. He spoke little of his affairs, mostly books and letters, never any visitors as far as I know." Purbright walked through the modest room, observing the alignment of furniture, the careful arrangement of books, the faint scent of lavender in the curtains. Nothing seemed amiss, yet everything spoke of a life deliberately ordered, contained, and unobserved, a life that had ended in an entirely public collapse. Returning to the tea shop, Purbright paused in front of the silver locket, now resting behind the counter under Miss Potts's watchful care. He studied it briefly, noting the delicate engraving on its surface, the subtle clasp that suggested both value and sentiment. There was a story here, he reflected, embedded in the choice of the object and the circumstances of its presence. But it would require patience to unravel, as Flaxborough's inhabitants were unlikely to volunteer truth freely, preferring instead the artful reshaping of events to suit their own narratives. He made his way back to the station, observing once more the subtle movements of the market square, the understated agitation in the shop windows, and the quiet whispers of those passing. Each person, each gesture, each glance contained its own fragment of the puzzle, waiting for the correct sequence to emerge. Purbright settled behind his desk, leaning back slightly as he catalogued the interviews in the methodical fashion that suited his temperament. There were inconsistencies, certainly, though nothing that leapt out with certainty. More importantly, there were absences, expected contacts not present at the scene, letters unsent, appointments unmet, that hinted at the quiet manoeuvrings of a life under discreet surveillance. He paused, thinking of the locket, the collapse, and the way the town had responded. There was an understated, almost imperceptible strain in the communal fabric, the sort that only a careful observer might detect, a faint tension between propriety and curiosity, between politeness and suspicion. And in that tension, Purbright knew these subtle motives, small resentments and minor jealousies that could easily culminate in tragedy if one was sufficiently observant to perceive them. By evening he had assembled his preliminary notes, a delicate framework of potential leads, human foibles and social patterns. Each person he had spoken to, Miss Potts, Mrs. Redding, Mrs. Tremlett, Mr. Fisk, Mrs. Calvert, offered a fragment, a reflection of personal bias or observation, and none of it could yet be trusted without careful cross-reference. And yet even at this early stage, Purbright felt the faint outlines of an unfolding story, a narrative of secrecy, understated tension, and the quiet disruptions that so often punctuated life in Flaxborough. It would not be the loud scandal or public outrage that revealed the truth, but rather the patient accumulation of small details, the careful interpretation of human behavior, and the gentle nudging of those who knew more than they admitted. As he turned out the light in his office, the town lay quiet beneath a lowering sky, the market square deserted, and the lilac tea shop closed for the day. Within its walls, Miss Potts arranged her cups, the silver locket gleaming faintly in the evening light. Outside, shutters rattled in the breeze, and the faint murmur of distant voices hinted that Flaxborough's quiet rumour mill had already begun its inexorable work. Purbright, patient and observant, would wait and watch, knowing that in time the smallest details would guide him to the truth. By the following morning, the town of Flaxborough had settled into the peculiar rhythm of speculation, a rhythm in which certainty was a rare commodity and gossip served as the principal currency. The death at the lilac tea shop counter had been absorbed into the daily round, discussed politely over breakfast porridge, while being coloured with increasingly imaginative details. Some claimed the gentleman had been clutching the locket, not merely for sentiment, but as evidence of a secret affair. Others whispered darkly of business disputes and shadowy acquaintances unknown to ordinary townsfolk. Amid these half-truths, the local constabulary had begun to lean toward a tidy explanation, one that would both reassure the town and provide a convenient narrative. Inspector Purbright, however, observed quietly, aware that convenience is seldom a reliable guide to truth. He arrived at the tea shop shortly after opening time, noting with mild amusement the way Miss Potts had positioned the silver locket atop the counter, as though it were both a talisman and a warning. Mrs. Tremlett and Mrs. Redding had already taken their customary seats near the window, and even in this ordinary morning light there was a distinct air of anticipation. P.C. Harris, standing awkwardly by the doorway, greeted Purbright with an anxious glance. "Sir, we've had some suggestions from the council about who might be responsible," he said, his voice pitched low, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "They've fixated on Mr. Galbraith. He was in the tea shop earlier, they say, and apparently had a dispute with Mr. Langley last week over some transaction. They're confident it must be him." Purbright raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Convenience, he thought, is not evidence, and public opinion is never a substitute for observation. Still, the mention of Mr. Galbraith warranted polite inquiry. "Very well," he said softly. "Let us speak with him. I would like to hear his account first-hand. Mr. Galbraith, a man of neat moustache and tight-lipped expression, was found in his shop arranging fine leather gloves. He greeted Purbright with a measured nod, aware of both the gravity of the visit and the whispered assumptions already circulating in town. "Inspector," he said, voice carefully modulated, "I trust this is routine. I assure you I had no involvement with him." Paused, clearly aware of the delicate phrasing, Mr. Langley's unfortunate demise. "Of course, Mr. Galbraith," Purbright replied, bowing slightly. "I seek only the facts as you observed them. Please recount your activities yesterday morning in detail." Galbraith straightened, combing his fingers through his moustache with a nervous precision. "I arrived at my shop at precisely 8:30, as always. I had no business at the tea shop until later in the morning, around 11. I encountered Mr. Langley briefly in the market square. I believe he was browsing the stalls, but we had no conversation beyond polite greetings. I then returned to my shop, attended to my customers, and did not leave until closing." He paused, glancing toward the window as though the very street might contradict him. "I can provide several witnesses if necessary." Purbright listened without comment, noting the precise attention to timing and detail. "And you did not observe anything unusual at the tea shop before the incident?" he asked. "Nothing unusual, Inspector, I assure you." Galbraith's voice was firm, though a faint tension betrayed the effort it took to maintain that certainty. Returning to the tea shop, Purbright allowed himself a quiet observation of the patrons, all of whom seemed to have absorbed the notion of Galbraith's presumed guilt with a mixture of relief and moral satisfaction. Mrs. Tremlett nodded discreetly, whispering to Mrs. Redding, "Well, that explains it, doesn't it? The council would hardly suggest him otherwise." Purbright took note of the almost imperceptible shift in posture, the small satisfaction that accompanies the public assignment of blame. Yet he remained unconvinced. Evidence must always outweigh narrative convenience, and Galbraith, for all his neat precision and polished persona, offered nothing but opportunity to gossip, not motive or method. Meanwhile, the locket, still displayed under Miss Potts's watchful eyes, seemed to pulse with significance. Its intricate engraving suggested not merely aesthetic value but personal attachment, a story embedded in its tiny surface. Purbright examined it carefully, noting the hinge, the clasp, the subtle signs of wear that indicated frequent handling. Objects, after all, often outlast the flimsy disguises of human behavior. They retained a memory that witnesses did not. He spent the remainder of the morning conducting a quiet perusal of the market square, observing interactions, noting expressions, and collecting fragments of overheard conversation. There was Mrs. Pargeter, who remarked upon the audacity of the event while arranging her ribbons, Mr. Fisk, still polishing his brass handles, who commented on the timing of arrivals, and a baker's assistant who mentioned having seen a man loitering near the square shortly before the incident, his features briefly noted but quickly forgotten. Each detail, innocuous alone, contributed to the subtle mosaic that Purbright began to assemble in his mind. By mid-afternoon, he returned to the police station to review the town's reaction, the whispers now forming tentative connections, the rumours solidifying into a preferred narrative. Galbraith, convenient though he might be, was not the centre of Purbright's attention. Instead, it was the minor anomalies, the hesitation of witnesses, the almost imperceptible timing of arrivals and departures, the tiny but persistent disturbances in otherwise orderly routines. He considered in particular the behavior of the deceased prior to collapse. Langley's apparent anxiety, the way he glanced repeatedly toward the door, the careful clutching of the locket all suggested awareness of something or someone in a manner inconsistent with sudden, accidental death. And yet, in the absence of direct evidence, only observation could guide the investigation. Even as the town leaned toward Galbraith as a neat solution, Purbright continued his quiet, deliberate cataloguing. He visited the neighboring streets, spoke to shopkeepers, and observed patterns of arrival and departure, noting subtle deviations from the norm. Each interaction was polite, understated, and superficially trivial, yet beneath the civility lay a wealth of insight, a slightly elevated pulse in a nervous hand, the glance of recognition quickly withdrawn, a phrase repeated with unusual emphasis. By evening, he returned to the lilac tea shop, where Miss Potts was arranging chairs and washing cups with meticulous care. The silver locket rested once more on the counter, catching the light in such a way that it seemed to draw the eye despite its modest size. Purbright examined it, noting the faint scratches and the delicate hinge, and permitted himself a quiet reflection in Flaxborough. Convenience often masquerades as fact, but the truth, as always, requires patience, observation, and a careful weighing of subtle inconsistencies. Outside, the market square was silent, the low hum of conversation replaced by the occasional clatter of closing shutters. The town, satisfied with its convenient suspect, had settled into a fragile equilibrium, unaware that the neat narrative assigned to Galbraith was only a temporary reprieve from uncertainty. Within this calm lay the perfect conditions for observation, and Purbright, ever patient, was content to wait. The first obvious suspect had been identified, the town had rallied around him, and yet the true story, delicate, hidden, and entwined with the minutiae of human behavior, remained to be uncovered. Purbright knew that it would require time, subtle interrogation, and a careful reading of social cues. In Flaxborough, as he had learned over decades, the loudest voices rarely spoke the truth, while the quietest gestures often revealed the whole narrative. As he left the tea shop and walked through the fading light toward the station, he reflected on the lesson implicit in the day's events. Convenience may comfort the public, but truth is always a matter of persistence, patience, and the unhurried accumulation of evidence invisible to those eager for closure. And so, with the town slumbering in its self-satisfied assumptions, Inspector Purbright prepared to continue his quiet, exacting work, aware that the path to understanding was never straight and never hurried. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke under a pale sun, the mist curling lazily around the market square, giving the town an air of soft apprehension. Inspector Purbright, as usual, took the leisurely route along the high street toward the lilac tea shop, noting with a faintly amused precision the minor shifts in human behavior. Shopkeepers glanced furtively at him, as though their early morning conversations might be under discreet scrutiny. The postman lingered a moment longer on doorsteps, and Mrs. Tremlett, already at her customary vantage point, gave a small wave that seemed to carry the weight of expectation. Inside the tea shop, Miss Potts greeted him with restrained courtesy, her hands folded neatly over her apron. The silver locket rested once again on the counter, catching the morning light in the same subtle, insistently gleaming way that had first drawn his attention. "Inspector," she said, in a voice carefully moderated between curiosity and politeness, "I trust your day has been uneventful so far." Purbright inclined his head, setting down his notebook. "As uneventful as mornings can be in Flaxborough, Miss Potts," he replied, though he observed with quiet interest that the tea shop, in its meticulous order, offered the perfect stage for subtle anomaly. He allowed himself to walk slowly around the counter, noting the placement of cups, the alignment of chairs, and the trajectory of shadows as the sun shifted through the window panes, it was then that a minor but distinctly incongruous detail caught his attention. The napkin holder on the far side of the counter, slightly askew. He reached out, adjusting it ever so slightly, and noticed a faint smudge of soot along the baseboard where it had rested. At first glance it was insignificant, almost laughable in its triviality. Yet Purbright paused. In Flaxborough, the smallest deviations often revealed far more than the most obvious evidence. The tea shop was fastidiously maintained. Nothing was out of place without reason. And soot in a location so meticulously kept suggested both carelessness and an attempt at concealment, a curious contradiction. He turned his attention to the silver locket. The hinge, though fine, bore a subtle scratch as though it had been hastily opened and closed. He ran a gloved finger along its edge, noting the wear, the faint fingerprints, and the absence of dust in certain small crevices. Someone had handled it recently deliberately and not entirely for sentiment. Miss Potts, watching, leaned forward slightly. "It's a curious object, isn't it, Inspector?" she said softly. "I cannot imagine why anyone would treasure it so much as to clutch it so frantically, or to fall over it, as one might say." She looked away, as if self-conscious about her phrasing. "Indeed," Purbright murmured, pocketing the observation. In Flaxborough, as he well knew, people often revealed their understanding of a situation without realizing the significance of their own phrasing. Words, gestures, and even misapplied idioms often carried more information than polite testimony. He next turned to Mrs. Tremlett and Mrs. Redding, who was seated near the window, exchanged low whispers that stopped abruptly as he approached. "Good morning," he said, mildly. "I wonder if you might indulge me with your observations of yesterday morning once more, but this time let us focus on the minutiae, small movements, gestures, anything you might have deemed trivial at the time." Mrs. Tremlett, clutching her basket of apples as if it were a shield against the intrusion of formality, began hesitantly. "Well, Inspector, I suppose." Perhaps it was the way he held the locket. His hand trembled slightly, though not with fear. More, I think, with anticipation. "And I did notice something odd, a faint mark on the counter near where he collapsed. I thought it was a scratch, but now that you mention it—" She trailed off, eyes wide. Mrs. Redding nodded solemnly. Yes, I saw that too. A small smear of something, perhaps dust, perhaps something else. It was hardly noticeable, and I did not think it was important at the time, but I remember thinking that his fall was different somehow, staged, though I dare say I should not have put it in such words." Purbright made no immediate comment, filing the small revelations with care. The mark on the counter, the trembling hand, the unusual handling of the locket, all were minor, almost inconsequential alone. Yet together they hinted at a carefully orchestrated scenario, one designed to mislead casual observers while concealing the true dynamics at play. By mid-morning, he had expanded his inquiries to include the neighbouring businesses. Mr. Fisk, polishing brass as meticulously as ever, had noticed a fleeting shadow near the tea shop doorway just before the collapse, a figure moving swiftly, pausing only momentarily before retreating into the square. He could not identify the person, but the hesitation in his voice suggested that the observation, however fragmentary, was genuine. Purbright also noted the timing of deliveries to the tea shop, the arrival of milk bottles, the brief visit from a florist, and the precise cadence of the morning post. Each routine event presented a reference point, a baseline against which deviations could be measured. And in all these minor, orderly movements, there were anomalies: the soot, the scratch, the shadow that collectively suggested intentional orchestration rather than mere accident. Returning to the tea shop, Purbright examined the locket once more, noting the delicate engraving on its surface. The initials were not immediately identifiable, but the pattern of wear suggested repeated opening and closing in moments of urgency. He considered the possibility that the man had expected to encounter someone, perhaps someone within the tea shop itself, and that the collapse, however genuine, had been influenced by knowledge of that impending encounter. Miss Potts, observing him quietly, finally asked, "Inspector, do you think someone wanted him to collapse?" Purbright allowed a faint smile, entirely private. "Perhaps, Miss Potts. And perhaps the collapse was not the conclusion, but a prelude to something yet unspoken. By noon, the subtle puzzle had begun to crystallize in his mind, a minor object handled with care and urgency, a man exhibiting preemptive anticipation, faint traces of disturbance in an otherwise orderly setting, and the curious attentions of townsfolk whose observations, though sincere, were filtered through a lens of personal interest and social expectation. Each element, trivial on its own, gained significance through combination, revealing patterns invisible to casual eyes. The rest of the afternoon was devoted to quiet, methodical observation. Purbright walked the square, noting the ebb and flow of townsfolk, their interactions and their reactions to the gossip circulating more rapidly now than ever before. There was Mrs. Pargeter arranging ribbons in her shop window, who cast a brief, startled glance in his direction, a baker's assistant delivering rolls, pausing to peer at the tea shop, and a postman adjusting his route to linger just slightly near a corner window. Each gesture, each pause, each glance was catalogued meticulously. For in Flaxborough, the truth was rarely loud, never abrupt, and almost never revealed through force. It was, instead, the accumulation of minor details, the quiet inconsistencies, and the small behaviours that revealed intent and concealment. By evening, he returned to the station, notebooks filled not with dramatic revelations but with subtle anomalies, a smear here, a shadow there, a hesitation in speech, a scratch on a delicate hinge. These, he knew, were the breadcrumbs that would eventually lead to understanding. And in the quiet hours of the night, with Flaxborough settled in polite speculation, Inspector Purbright allowed himself the faintest satisfaction. The first hints of pattern had emerged, and patience, as always, would see them through. The morning air in Flaxborough carried its usual understated charm, but to Inspector Purbright it also bore the faint, persistent tension of a town adjusting to unease. The Lilac Tea Shop, now closed for cleaning and careful restoration, remained a focal point, but attention had begun to shift toward the wider array of townspeople, each potentially holding a fragment of truth or a carefully polished misdirection. Purbright had concluded that a wider circle of inquiry was necessary. The convenience of Mr. Galbraith as a suspect was increasingly unsatisfying, and the minor but telling anomalies — he had noted the scratch on the locket, the faint soot on the counter, the fleeting shadow in the doorway — demanded a broader scrutiny of Flaxborough's social fabric. He began with Mr. Bletchley, the town accountant, whose stooped form and precise manner suggested a man both methodical and observant. The accountant had been in the square around the time of the collapse, ostensibly on his morning walk, though Purbright noted that such routine often masked curiosity. "Mr. Bletchley," he said, settling into the chair opposite, "I wonder if you might recount your movements yesterday morning. Anything observed, however minor, may be of assistance." Bletchley adjusted his spectacles, fingers tapping a quiet rhythm on the desk. "Inspector, I was merely traversing the square, as is my habit, to ensure that accounts and financial transactions of the day proceed with proper oversight. I did notice the gentleman at the tea shop, yes, but my attention was primarily on the deliveries and market operations. I would not presume to offer conjecture beyond that." "Still you observed him," Purbright said quietly. Did anything in his behavior strike you as unusual? The accountant hesitated. Perhaps a slight nervousness, nothing overt, just a hesitation in manner. And the way he glanced at the doorway as if expecting someone. But I did not consider it significant. I am not accustomed to interpreting social gestures beyond their immediate appearance. Purbright made a note, mentally cataloguing the accumulation of anticipatory behavior, the recurrent glance toward the doorway, and the delicate handling of the locket. It suggested expectation or perhaps even fear of an encounter, yet the town's first suspect remained undisturbed in public perception. Next, he spoke with Miss Fairchild, a schoolmistress known for her rigorous attention to detail and her fondness for gossip cloaked in academic restraint. She offered her account with precision and faint theatricality. "Inspector, I noticed Mr. Langley consulting a small notebook as he moved through the square. He appeared to be noting the positions of certain stalls, or perhaps individuals, though his handwriting was indecipherable at a distance. Later, at the Teashop, he adjusted the locket repeatedly, almost as if verifying a code. But I cannot claim certainty. It was all very subtle, fleeting." Subtle indeed, thought Purbright. The repetition of minor actions, checking, glancing, adjusting, pointed to a man with purpose, aware of observers, and meticulous in preparation. It was a pattern he intended to explore further, though he remained cautious. Observation alone could mislead if not corroborated. He paused in the square to watch the flow of human traffic, noting the way townsfolk moved with measured rhythm, yet occasionally paused to whisper behind lace curtains, exchange glances across streets, or tilt heads in a conspiratorial nod. The town's quiet disquiet was no accident. It was the product of both curiosity and the social necessity of conjecture. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had visited Mr. and Mrs. Allerton, proprietors of the confectionery shop, whose proximity to the Teashop offered them a potentially advantageous perspective. The Allertons were eager to recount their observations, emphasizing every fleeting shadow, each hurried glance, and the minutiae of Langley's interactions with passers-by. "He was polite, Inspector, but reserved," Mrs. Allerton said. "He kept the locket close, never letting it rest. And when a boy dropped a basket of sweets nearby, he flinched slightly, though there was no reason for alarm. Purbright noted the pattern of anticipation, minor flinches and careful monitoring. It was not evidence of a crime, not yet, but it was evidence of intent and awareness. The man had expected something or someone, and had acted with calculated restraint in a public environment. Returning to the Teashop in the late afternoon, Purbright allowed himself a longer observation of the interior. The faint soot smear remained, almost imperceptible to casual inspection, and the locket's subtle scratches suggested recent manipulation. He considered the physical space carefully, the location of chairs, the trajectory of the man's fall, the positioning of the counter, and the likely paths of anyone entering or leaving. Each detail, individually minor, was now beginning to form a lattice of possibility paths and patterns that could be followed if one observed without distraction. As he walked through the market square once more, he noted a small convergence of people near the fountain. Among them was Mr. Lenton, a retired solicitor known for his sharp mind and occasional propensity for meddling. Lenton spoke to a small circle about the incident, emphasizing the public collapse and noting the silver locket with a faintly disdainful tone. "A curious object for such a gentleman," he said, voice deliberately audible, though perhaps more telling for its owner than for anyone else. Purbright observed quietly, noting the emphasis on ownership. In Flaxborough, personal property often carried implications far beyond its market value. It signaled connections, obligations, and sometimes concealed disputes. Every glance, every whispered remark offered potential insight. By evening, the town had settled into its usual rhythm, though the subtle ripples of curiosity persisted. Shop windows reflected the fading light, casting elongated shadows that moved like tentative fingers across cobbled streets. Inside the tea shop, Miss Potts arranged cups with careful precision, ensuring that the locket remained visible, yet protected a silent, gleaming witness to events past and intentions yet to be revealed. Purbright returned to the police station, where he reviewed his notes once more. Each account, though seemingly trivial, began to reveal a network of small interactions, minor grievances, and social pressures. A man who anticipated observation, townsfolk who speculated with varying degrees of accuracy, and a series of subtle clues that collectively suggested intent and orchestration. He leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. The death at the tea shop counter was no longer a simple matter of a convenient suspect or a sudden collapse. It was the product of social maneuvering, careful observation, and perhaps a small but deliberate misdirection designed to obscure the truth. Patience, as always, would be required, and the human propensity for error, embellishment, and concealment would, he suspected, eventually provide the clarity he sought. Outside, Flaxborough lay in its modest quietude, the low hum of activity masking the latent tension, and the faint glint of the silver locket caught the last rays of the setting sun, as though winking at a patient observer who had yet to uncover the full story. In the subtle interplay of minor details and restrained human behavior, Inspector Purbright knew the path to understanding, and he was content to follow it, step by measured step. Flaxborough awoke to an air more unsettled than usual. The morning sun, pale and hesitant behind low-hanging clouds, seemed to suggest that the town itself was bracing for another subtle disturbance. Inspector Purbright, who had spent the previous evening cataloguing anomalies, inconsistencies, and minor observations, sensed that the quiet equilibrium he had observed in the town was fragile. His patient attention to the behavior of both the deceased and the townsfolk had revealed a pattern, yet one that remained incomplete. The gaps between actions, gestures, and words now loomed larger in his mind. The lilac tea shop, its windows reflecting the pale light, had reopened, though Miss Potts's movements were noticeably more deliberate, her porcelain cups and napkins arranged with almost ritual precision. The silver locket, still gleaming faintly on the counter, drew Purbright's eye at once. Its delicate scratches, the subtle smudge from earlier observation, and its central placement all suggested continued significance. He made a quiet note. Objects, unlike witnesses, do not exaggerate, do not misremember, and do not embellish. They offer only what has been left in their care. By mid-morning, a minor commotion drew attention in the high street. Mr. Fisk, polishing brass with habitual dedication, approached with cautious urgency. "Inspector," he said, voice low, "there's been another incident at the railway buffet." A lady fainted quite suddenly, and in her handbag was a locket, almost identical to the one at the tea shop. She claims it belonged to her niece, though the resemblance is uncanny. Purbright's eyes flickered with mild curiosity. Coincidences, particularly of such precise similarity, rarely existed in small towns. He rose and allowed himself a measured pace toward the railway station, observing the subtle stirrings of the town as news began to ripple outward. Shopkeepers peered from doorways, the baker paused mid-knead, Mrs. Tremlett adjusted her hat and glanced toward the square. Flaxborough was alive with curiosity, yet the tone was muted, polite, and entirely local gossip tempered by the ever-present demand for civility. At the railway buffet, the scene was contained and understated. The faintly distressed lady, Miss Aldridge, was attended by the station master and a junior clerk. Purbright introduced himself with quiet formality, noting the woman's composure despite the apparent fainting spell. "I understand, Miss
Aldridge?
That a locket was involved? Yes, Inspector, she replied, carefully retrieving the small silver object from her handbag. It belonged to my niece. I can assure you I had no intention of causing a disturbance. I merely wished to admire it for a moment, and I felt faint. I was so embarrassed. Purbright examined the locket with attention to detail. It bore the same intricate engraving pattern as the one at the tea shop, though there were subtle differences in wear. Both objects, clearly cherished, were of similar craftsmanship, suggesting either a shared origin or imitation. The faint pattern of scratches and the way the chain reflected light hinted at frequent handling, yet the precise use, whether sentimental or purposeful, remained uncertain. "Were you aware of the gentleman at the tea shop yesterday, Miss Aldridge?" Purbright asked softly. "No," she said, "I've no connection. My niece lives some distance away. I merely brought the locket for personal reasons." She appeared genuinely confused, though there was an undertone of discomfort in her gestures, a subtle tension in her posture. Purbright nodded, his mind cataloguing the convergence of minor events. The duplicate locket, the fainting episode, the anxiety of those involved, all suggested that the original incident at the tea shop might not have been as isolated as the town had assumed. Opportunity, it seemed, could exist beyond a single individual, and motive might be intertwined with social networks previously unnoticed. Returning to the tea shop, he noted the increased quiet tension. Miss Potts, polishing cups with meticulous care, observed him over the rims of her spectacles. "Another locket?" she murmured, voice tinged with restrained curiosity. "Yes," Purbright said. "Though the circumstances differ, the similarity is striking. I would like to speak further with those present yesterday, and with anyone who might have noticed unusual activity in the vicinity." He began a series of discreet inquiries throughout the afternoon, speaking with shopkeepers, delivery staff, and even the occasional pedestrian whose observations might otherwise seem trivial. Each account added a thread the way Mr. Lenton lingered near the fountain, commenting on the tea shop incident. The baker's apprentice who had seen a gentleman loitering in the square at precisely the same time as Langley's collapse. A delivery man noting that Miss Potts had received an unexpected package the day before, its contents not immediately apparent. As he pieced together the observations, Purbright noted the recurring theme of anticipation and concealment. The deceased had exhibited a keen awareness of observation. The townsfolk had responded predictably to perceived threat, and the arrival of the second locket now suggested a deliberate pattern rather than mere coincidence. By evening, he returned once more to the police station, reviewing his notes carefully. There was the faint trace of soot, the subtle scratch on the first locket, the shadow glimpsed in the doorway, the replicated locket at the railway buffet, and the series of hesitations, glances, and minor disturbances catalogued from numerous witnesses. Each element alone might have been dismissed, but together they suggested orchestration, awareness, and intent, an intricate network of human behavior pointing toward a deliberate act, though the actor remained obscured beneath layers of small-town civility. Purbright allowed himself a small, private reflection. The town's eagerness to settle upon Galbraith as a suspect was no longer sufficient. The second incident had altered the narrative, introduced complexity, and made apparent the inadequacy of first impressions. He would need to consider motive, opportunity, and the quiet intricacies of social behavior more carefully than ever. Outside, Flaxborough lay in its habitual calm, though the town itself was subtly unsettled. Shop windows reflected the fading light, the occasional figure moving with deliberate care along the square, and the faint glimmer of the silver locket in Miss Potts's tea shop caught the last rays of the sun. In these understated details, Purbright recognized both the persistence of human curiosity and the latent tension of secrets unspoken. He knew, with the certainty afforded by long experience, that truth in Flaxborough never revealed itself through spectacle. It emerged quietly through observation, patience, and careful reading of human behavior. And now, with a second incident, the threads were multiplying, the web becoming more intricate. Somewhere within this network lay both the motive and the method, obscured to all but a careful and patient observer. As he prepared for the next day of inquiries, Purbright allowed himself the faintest satisfaction. The town's narrative was shifting, its tidy assumptions disrupted, and in the quiet hum of anticipation he perceived the faint outlines of understanding. Patience would guide him, subtle observation would illuminate the obscure, and eventually the patterns now scattered across tea shops and railway buffets would converge into clarity, as inevitable as the slow turning of a well-oiled mechanism. By late afternoon, Inspector Purbright found himself in the quiet sanctuary of his office, the usual hum of Flaxborough's Market Square muffled by closed shutters and the gentle rustle of papers. The two incidents, the collapse at the Lilac Tea Shop and the fainting of Miss Aldridge at the railway buffet, occupied the forefront of his thoughts, but it was the subtle interstices between events, the delicate human behaviors and minor anomalies that demanded closer reflection. He leaned back in his chair, hands folded, as if measuring the town itself against the catalogue of observations he had collected. It was a peculiarity of small towns, Purbright mused, that events of significance often arose from the most modest of provocations. In Flaxborough, a single misplacement, a fleeting glance, or the anxious handling of a treasured object could ripple outward, subtly influencing perception and behavior in ways that appeared disproportionate only in retrospect. The silver locket at the tea shop and its near duplicate at the buffet exemplified this principle, objects imbued with personal significance that became catalysts for human response. He considered the witnesses, each person filtered through their own concerns and idiosyncrasies. Miss Potts, meticulous to the point of ritual, had a natural attentiveness that allowed her to perceive minor disturbances, yet restrained her from embellishing them beyond propriety. Mrs. Tremlett, ever theatrical, added colour and emphasis, yet her exaggerations contained kernels of truth, a nervous flinch here, a hesitant glance there. Even Mr. Fiske, whose focus on brass polishing was almost sacred, had observed a fleeting shadow, a minor deviation that, when considered in isolation, seemed trivial but contributed to a larger pattern. Purbright reflected upon Langley himself. The man's preemptive glances toward the doorway, the repeated adjustments of the locket, the slight tension in his posture all suggested a consciousness of scrutiny, an awareness of observers, and perhaps a knowledge of anticipated interaction. The collapse, while outwardly abrupt, had left traces of the faint smudge of soot on the tea shop counter, the subtle scratches on the locket's hinge, and the carefully preserved order of objects around him. Even in death, the gentleman had left a message, subtle yet deliberate, for those attuned to notice. And then there were the townspeople, whose reactions were as telling as the events themselves. Flaxborough was a community in which social propriety dictated behaviour, yet beneath that surface lurked curiosity, suspicion, and a measure of private judgment. The eagerness to assign blame to Mr. Galbraith, though convenient, revealed more about communal psychology than about evidence. People seek closure, an identifiable culprit, a tidy conclusion. The truth, however, is rarely so accommodating. He thought also of the fainting at the railway buffet. The similarity of the locket, the suddenness of the episode, and the nervous, almost apologetic explanation offered by Miss Aldridge suggested either coincidence of extraordinary precision or an intentional orchestration designed to mislead. The pattern of repetition was a thread, faint but discernible, connecting otherwise isolated events. Purbright allowed himself a quiet smile. It was the habitual tendency of human beings to disclose more than they intended, whether through gestures, phrasing, or hesitation. The inconsistencies in the accounts, Mrs. Redding's anticipatory interpretation, Mrs. Tremlett's flinches, the brief observations of minor passers-by, offered a lattice upon which truth might be built if approached with patience and careful reasoning. He considered opportunity and motive separately. Opportunity in Flaxborough was rarely hidden. It was observable, woven into daily routines and predictable interactions. Motive, however, was less overt. A slight envy here, a grudging resentment there, or the desire to manipulate perception, all were subtle, easily overlooked yet potent. Combined with minor provocations, they had the capacity to culminate in acts that appeared sudden, arbitrary, or even accidental. The scratch on the locket, so easily dismissed by the casual observer, suggested hurried handling and anxiety that might indicate either anticipation or concealment. The soot smudge, likewise trivial at first glance, implied contact with an otherwise clean surface, evidence of movement or presence beyond the ordinary routine. The shadow glimpsed in the doorway, fleeting and easily ignored, hinted at surveillance, awareness, or complicity. Each element alone could be explained away. Together they formed a network, a subtle but coherent map of human behavior and intention. Purbright's mind turned to the concept of testing human nature, a method he employed often in such investigations. Polite questions, casual remarks, and staged encounters could reveal more than direct interrogation. People, when relaxed or otherwise momentarily unguarded, betrayed inconsistencies, admitted faint truths, or displayed reactions that hinted at hidden knowledge. The town's polite surface, with its careful social choreography, often concealed the most revealing gestures. By early evening, he allowed himself to review the social map of the town as it related to the incidents. Miss Potts remained central, both as witness and custodian of the locket. Mrs. Tremlett and Mrs. Redding, though peripheral, provided insight into communal perception and minor embellishment of facts. Mr. Galbraith, convenient as he appeared, offered opportunity and attention but no sufficient motive. And other actors, the Allertons, Mr. Lenton, Mr. Fisk, and even Miss Aldridge, contributed to the pattern, each a node in a lattice of awareness, minor conflict, and potential manipulation. Purbright leaned back, noting the recurrent theme in Flaxborough. Truth rarely resided in the obvious. It emerged from the observation of small details, from patient reading of gestures, timing, and social habits. The combination of expectation, anxiety, and minor social missteps revealed intent far more clearly than any confession or confrontation. As the shadows lengthened in the office, he permitted himself a quiet reflection on human foibles. The desire to conceal, the need for recognition, the impulse to control perception, these were forces far more powerful than brute action. In the understated theatre of the Teashop, the fainting at the railway buffet, and the ripple of gossip through the town, all were evident, encoded in behavior rather than speech. He made a small note in his journal: patience, observation, minor inconsistencies, repeated patterns, social pressure, gestures of expectation. Each phrase encapsulated the essence of what he had seen and what he anticipated. The town, ever polite, ever careful, would reveal more than they realized if one merely watched, listened, and waited. Outside, Flaxborough settled into the calm of early evening, the market square quieting, shutters closing, and the glow of lamps reflecting softly on cobbles damp from an afternoon drizzle. The lilac tea shop, its interior meticulously ordered, remained central, a silent witness to the subtle disturbances that had begun to unravel the predictable order. Purbright, seated behind his desk with a quiet cup of tea, allowed himself a small measure of satisfaction. The narrative was forming, the threads were weaving together, and though no direct conclusion was yet apparent, the outlines of understanding were emerging. It would require more observation, more gentle probing, and the testing of human patience. Yet the path was becoming clear. In Flaxborough, as always, the truth would not shout, it would whisper, and only the attentive ear would discern it. The following morning, Flaxborough seemed almost entirely ordinary, though those with a keener eye detected a faint tension beneath the town's usual civility. Inspector Purbright, seated at his desk in the police station with an untouched cup of tea, reviewed his notes from the past days, subtle glances, minor anomalies, repeated gestures, and the pattern of human behavior that suggested expectation, observation, and concealment. It was time, he concluded, to move from passive observation to gentle provocation, a test designed to unsettle without accusation, to observe reactions without direct confrontation. He first visited the lilac tea shop where Miss Potts was arranging cups in her customary meticulous fashion. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, voice careful. "I trust you had a restful evening." "Relatively so, Miss Potts," Purbright replied, glancing at the silver locket once more. "I would like to conduct a small exercise today, simply observing responses to certain inquiries. Nothing official, merely conversational." Miss Potts inclined her head, curiosity tinged with apprehension. "Very well, Inspector, I shall do my best." Purbright began with casual conversations, designed to appear as ordinary interest rather than investigation. He asked the patrons about the weather, recent market arrivals, and minor civic matters, noting every hesitation, glance, and inflection. Each answer was recorded mentally, not merely for content, but for how quickly the speaker responded, whether their eyes shifted toward the locket, and whether gestures betrayed slight tension or composure beyond ordinary expectation. When Mrs. Tremlett arrived carrying her usual basket of apples, he directed a seemingly innocuous comment toward her. "Mrs. Tremlett," he said lightly, "I heard an intriguing account of a gentleman at the tea shop clutching a locket. Some say he appeared nervous, almost anticipating an encounter. Did you notice anything of that sort?" The elderly lady paused mid-step, eyes widening subtly, hands tightening on the basket handle. Well, Inspector, I might have noticed something, but you understand it was all rather fleeting. I hardly thought it, well, significant." Her hesitation, though polite, was revealing. Next, he arranged a brief visit from Mr. Lenton, the retired solicitor, who had shown keen interest in both the tea shop incident and the railway buffet fainting. Purbright invited him to inspect the locket, ostensibly out of curiosity. Lenton's eyes lingered longer than necessary on the scratches along the hinge, and a faint tightening of the jaw suggested recognition, subtle but observable. "Curious, isn't it?" Purbright said softly. "Two such items handled with care, yet found in unexpected circumstances. One might almost imagine a connection, though coincidence is always possible." Lenton's reply was measured, overly precise. "Indeed, Inspector, but coincidences do occur, particularly in small towns where patterns are readily imagined." He avoided direct eye contact with the locket, a small but telling gesture. Purbright noted the minor shifts in hesitations, micro-expressions, and deviations from the expected rhythm of conversation. Each subtle reaction was a thread, guiding him toward the unspoken truths that lay beneath Flaxborough's polite exterior. In the afternoon, he visited the railway buffet once more, casually remarking on the fainting incident to Miss Aldridge. "A curious event yesterday," he said, tone light. "Two similar lockets, both involved in sudden collapses. It might make one ponder whether small objects bear a larger influence than one supposes." Miss Aldridge, adjusting her posture and brushing a strand of hair behind her ear, seemed momentarily unsettled. "I assure you, Inspector, I am no relation to the gentleman at the tea shop. The similarity is, well, peculiar, yes, but nothing more. Purbright allowed the comment to linger, observing her eyes, the slight tremor in her hands, and the manner in which she avoided dwelling on the locket. Small inconsistencies, he reflected, often revealed more than overt admissions. Returning to the tea shop in the early evening, he conducted what he considered the final phase of his test, a combined observation of multiple parties. Miss Potts, Mrs. Tremlett, Mrs. Redding, and Mr. Galbraith were all present under the guise of casual social interaction, discussing teas, pastries, and the general affairs of the market square. Purbright spoke lightly about the sequence of events, the collapse, the locket, the railway buffet fainting. Each word was carefully measured, designed to provoke reflection rather than accusation. He noted every glance exchanged, every subtle stiffening of posture, and every micro-expression of curiosity, unease, or recognition. It was in the quiet interlude following a casual mention of the locket that he observed the most telling behavior, a fleeting exchange of glances between two individuals, accompanied by a subtle adjustment of posture, a small, almost imperceptible nod. One of them, Mr. Galbraith, had not merely registered information, he had reacted to it in a manner suggesting prior knowledge or awareness beyond that of ordinary observation. Purbright allowed the moment to pass without comment. The reactions, he knew, were more informative than words could ever be. Polite conversation, ordinary in tone and manner, had become the instrument of revelation. The guilty party had betrayed the faintest hint of recognition, a signature of consciousness that could not be fabricated or suppressed entirely. As the evening light faded, the tea shop returned to its quiet rhythm, the locket resting on the counter as a silent observer. Purbright, standing near the doorway, allowed himself a final reflection. The threads were converging, the human tendencies toward concealment and subtle signals revealing themselves as if he had been watching the performance unfold in miniature theatre. Flaxborough, with all its civility, its whispered conjectures, and its orderly streets, had begun to expose its hidden tensions. Through the careful orchestration of small observations, minor perturbations, and the deliberate testing of human behavior, the outline of truth was beginning to take shape. Purbright left the tea shop with a quiet satisfaction. The test had been successful not through force, confrontation, or intimidation, but through subtlety, observation, and the patient manipulation of context. Reactions had been noted, inconsistencies recorded, and the faintest indications of guilt or prior awareness had emerged. He reflected on the elegance of human behavior as evidence, the hesitation of a glance, the tension in a hand, the fleeting acknowledgement of knowledge. In Flaxborough, the loudest voices rarely spoke the truth. It was in the quietest gestures, the polite diversions, and the subtle responses that the story revealed itself. By the time he returned to his office, the town had settled into the evening, the streets illuminated by soft lamplight, and the occasional movement of a pedestrian. The framework of understanding, carefully constructed through patient observation and measured inquiry, was now sufficiently developed to allow him to anticipate the next stage, the precise moment in which all elements, the minor details, the social observations, and the reactions of the guilty could be brought together to reveal the full story, clear and undeniable. Inspector Purbright, ever patient, closed his notebook and sipped his tea. Tomorrow, he reflected, would be a day for resolution, guided by the subtle truths he had unearthed with care and civility. In Flaxborough, the quietest observers, when attentive, hold the most profound insight. And the town, as always, remained blissfully unaware of the revelations that would soon emerge from its own orderly streets. By the following morning, the town of Flaxborough moved with a deceptive normality. Market stalls were arranged in their usual order, the tea shop gleamed behind its neat curtains, and the faint smell of baking drifted from the baker's shop, disguising any hint of unrest. Inspector Purbright, however, walked through the square with the quiet certainty of a man prepared to draw together threads long observed, each delicate clue waiting to be articulated into a coherent explanation. He began at the lilac tea shop, where Miss Potts arranged her teacups with meticulous care, the silver locket once again resting prominently on the counter. The usual patrons, Mrs. Tremlett, Mrs. Redding, and the occasional observer from across the square, sat with polite curiosity, unaware that the measured, civil revelation of truth would soon occupy the space as fully as the aroma of tea. "Good morning," Purbright said, his tone courteous, but carrying an undercurrent of deliberation. "I would like to invite a few of you to discuss yesterday's events in a quiet, organized fashion. There is no urgency, only clarity." One by one, the principal witnesses arrived: Miss Potts, Mrs. Tremlett, Mrs. Redding, and Mr. Galbraith. Even Mr. Lenton had been discreetly requested under the pretext of general civic interest. The assembly, though modest, contained all the key elements of the narrative, and Purbright allowed the group a moment to settle, observing gestures, postures, and subtle anticipations. He began with the silver locket, handling it carefully and allowing its surface to catch the morning sun. "This object," he said gently, "has played a greater role in Flaxborough's attention than any ordinary trinket might. Yet it is not merely an ornament. It has been the focal point of observation, anticipation, and, regrettably, deception." Miss Potts's eyes widened, though she maintained composure. Mrs. Tremlett clutched her basket more tightly. Mr. Galbraith adjusted his posture subtly, and Lenton's eyes flickered with measured attention. Each reaction was noted quietly, with no outward sign of the scrutiny applied. Purbright continued, outlining the sequence of events at the tea shop, the gentleman's entrance, the careful handling of the locket, the repeated glances toward the doorway, and finally the collapse at the counter. He described these occurrences in neutral terms, emphasizing observed behavior rather than inferred motive. "It is remarkable," he remarked, "how much information can be gleaned from gestures, timing, and small discrepancies in conduct." He moved on to the second incident at the railway buffet, recounting Miss Aldridge's fainting and the near-identical locket. Each detail was presented with care, factual and understated, allowing the listeners to absorb the chronology without alarm. The convergence of these two events was, Purbright suggested, no mere coincidence. Finally, he turned to the crux of the matter, the minor, previously overlooked details that had first captured his attention. The faint soot on the tea shop counter, the subtle scratch on the locket's hinge, and the shadow glimpsed at the doorway. Each of these, individually trivial, collectively suggested deliberate orchestration. "The gentleman at the tea shop," Purbright said softly, "was aware of observation, and his actions were intended to draw attention in a calculated manner. Yet those observations also concealed the true sequence of influence, the interactions of the townspeople themselves, the minor embellishments, and the anticipatory gestures." He allowed a pause, then addressed Mr. Galbraith directly, though without accusation. "Mr. Galbraith, your attention to the locket, the timing of your movements, and the subtle adjustments you made during the tea hour all were consistent with knowledge of circumstances that extended beyond casual observation. You were aware, were you not, of the intended trajectory of events?" Galbraith's response was measured, a tight-lipped murmur. I observed, "Yes, but I assure you, Inspector, I had no intention beyond mere curiosity." Purbright's gaze remained calm, courteous, yet precise. Curiosity, indeed, can explain a great deal, but not all. The repeated gestures, the anticipation, and the careful management of the locket suggest involvement. One does not manipulate expectation, observe reactions, and subtly guide outcomes without purpose. And as I have noted in my observations, purpose was present. He then turned to Miss Aldridge, gently linking the incidents. The fainting at the railway buffet with a near-identical locket was not an isolated event, but part of a pattern. The convergence of objects, actions, and reactions points to orchestration intended to produce a certain impression of accident or coincidence. Yet the minutiae gestures, hesitations, and the repeated adjustments betray deliberate intent. The room remained quiet, the townsfolk processing each measured observation. Purbright continued with the final pieces, the interplay of social observation, minor embellishments, and anticipatory behavior. In Flaxborough, as in any town, social propriety and politeness can conceal the most revealing gestures, hesitation, micro-expression, and subtle shifts in posture often speak louder than words. In this case, they revealed the actor's awareness, intent, and the gentle orchestration of events to produce a specific outcome. Finally, he paused, glancing at the silver locket one last time. Thus, the truth is not dramatic, nor is it violent. It is the product of careful observation, the manipulation of minor details, and the interplay of expectation and response. The guilty party did not act in overt malice, but through subtle orchestration, exploiting human tendencies toward embellishment, anticipation, and social politeness. He allowed the weight of the explanation to settle, and in that quiet, civil environment, the patterns became clear to those present. The minor clues, long observed, the scratch on the hinge, the soot on the counter, the anticipatory glances, the repeated handling of the locket, coalesced into an understandable narrative. The seemingly trivial events of the past week were now framed not as coincidence, but as an intricate interaction of observation, behavior, and subtle orchestration. The listeners, absorbing the calm, precise articulation of events, began to understand the pattern, the hidden motives, and the human behaviors that had contributed to what appeared at first to be a simple collapse. Flaxborough's civility and understated humour, once a veil, now revealed the full drama embedded in minor gestures and social expectation. Purbright concluded without emphasis, simply noting the elegance of human behaviour as evidence. In Flaxborough, as ever, the quietest actions often speak the loudest truths. Observation, patience, and a careful reading of behaviour reveal that which is otherwise hidden, and it is through such means that we discern the true course of events, even in the most ordinary of settings. As the assembly dispersed, the Teashop returned to its familiar calm, the silver locket resting quietly on the counter. The townsfolk, now equipped with understanding rather than suspicion, resumed their routine with subtle reflection, aware that what had seemed ordinary was, in fact, a delicate interplay of human behaviour, anticipation, and social subtlety. Purbright, alone for a moment, allowed himself a faint smile. The narrative was complete, not through confrontation, accusation, or force, but through patient observation, gentle testing, and careful articulation of subtle truths. Flaxborough, in its understated fashion, had revealed the hidden order behind apparent disorder, and the inspector had, with characteristic civility, guided the town to comprehension without drama. Tomorrow, life would continue, the market square would bustle, and the tea-shop would serve its tea. But for today, clarity prevailed quietly and thoroughly. The following morning, Flaxborough rose to a subtle calm, the kind that follows a disturbance acknowledged and understood. Market stalls opened with their familiar rhythm, the tea-shop displayed its polished porcelain and neatly arranged cups, and the soft aroma of brewing tea wafted through the high street as though nothing untoward had occurred. Yet beneath this civility lay the faint, enduring imprint of events that had quietly altered the town's perception, revealing the delicate tension between expectation, observation, and human foible. Inspector Purbright arrived at the tea-shop shortly after opening, his gait unhurried, hands folded behind his back. Miss Potts greeted him with her usual civility, though there was a subtle lightness in her expression, a small relief that clarity had replaced uncertainty. The silver locket, now central to the town's understanding, rested undisturbed on the counter, its delicate engraving catching the morning light and reflecting the modest sunbeam across the tiles. "The town seems calmer today, Inspector," she remarked softly. Though one suspects the memory of the event lingers beneath polite conversation. Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, Miss Potts, people are quick to resume routine, yet the quiet reflection remains. It is the nature of Flaxborough orderly, civil, yet attentive, particularly when minor deviations have revealed unexpected truths." He allowed his eyes to survey the patrons and passers-by. Mrs. Tremlett and Mrs. Redding arrived at their customary seats, both appearing composed yet subtly aware that the narrative had shifted. Even Mr. Galbraith, whose earlier attention had attracted his scrutiny, moved through the square with a restrained composure, aware that the subtle test and subsequent revelations had been observed and recorded. Purbright's day was spent cataloguing the aftermath with the same meticulous attention he had applied to the incidents themselves. He noted minor social adjustments in conversations that now included a faint awareness of human anticipation, the careful avoidance of overt speculation, and the polite alignment of behavior to the newly established understanding. The town's equilibrium had been restored, though subtly altered. Each person carried a trace of insight, small yet unmistakable, that would guide interactions for weeks to come. At the tea shop, Miss Potts busied herself with arranging afternoon tea, her hands steady, movements deliberate. "Inspector, do you think the town has fully absorbed your explanation?" she asked, voice quiet and tinged with curiosity. "I believe so," Purbright replied. "But Flaxborough is a town of careful observation. Some details will linger in private reflection longer than in public discourse. That is as it should be. People understand more than they articulate, and the nuances of behavior often speak louder than words." He noted, with mild amusement, the way Mrs. Tremlett carefully inspected her apples, a faintly reflective look in her eyes, while Mrs. Redding adjusted her spectacles as though considering the implications of subtle social manoeuvring. Each behavior was consistent with what he had observed over the course of the investigation, the combination of anticipation, observation, and human foible manifesting in small, graceful adjustments to routine. Outside the tea shop, the square hummed with its usual understated activity. Cyclists rattled past, shopkeepers arranged their goods, and pedestrians moved with polite deliberation. The faint ripple of discussion regarding the incidents persisted in subdued whispers, yet the tone was now measured, informed, and absent of conjecture. The silver locket, both object and symbol, had served its role, revealing through its presence the consequences of subtle orchestration, attentive observation, and minor human interventions. Purbright made a final circuit of the town, observing subtle interactions, a young couple exchanging glances that suggested new awareness of communal dynamics, a baker's apprentice noting a minor procedural change with quiet satisfaction, and the postman pausing to adjust a route, aware that the town's rhythm now included a faint measure of reflective caution. These small shifts collectively spoke to the broader resolution order had returned, tempered by insight. Returning to the police station, he allowed himself the measured calm of paperwork, cataloguing the final observations, verifying the timelines, and noting the alignment of minor details with social behavior. The soot smear on the tea shop counter, the hinge scratch on the locket, the anticipatory glances all had converged into a coherent understanding, providing closure without drama or public spectacle. In the quiet of his office, Purbright reflected on the elegance of the resolution. The town had been guided gently to comprehension, no accusations had been shouted, no public confrontation staged, and yet the truth had emerged through patient observation, careful testing, and the subtle orchestration of social cues, the human propensity for embellishment, anticipation, and minor deception had been accounted for, and the pattern revealed itself in the ordinary rhythms of Flaxborough life. He allowed a faint smile as he sipped his tea. The market square, the tea shop, and the surrounding streets had returned to normalcy, yet the awareness that underlay everyday actions had been subtly enhanced. The quiet satisfaction of understanding, the patience required to unravel behavior, and the civility of execution had brought closure in the most understated yet complete manner. By evening, the town had resumed its regular pace. Windows reflected the last light of day, lamps were lit along the streets, and the air carried its familiar calm, tinged only slightly with reflection. Miss Potts arranged her final cups before closing, the silver locket gleaming faintly as a silent witness. Flaxborough, as always, had maintained its polite order, yet beneath that routine, subtle lessons in human observation and social anticipation lingered. Inspector Purbright finally returned to his office. He arranged his notes, filed his observations, and prepared for the slow, deliberate work of follow-up reports. The town's social fabric had endured, minor tensions had been resolved, and the delicate equilibrium restored. The events, once seemingly disruptive, had revealed human nature in its quiet, intricate complexity, and he had guided understanding without spectacle or force. He poured himself a final cup of tea, savouring the calm, and considered the town in its entirety. Flaxborough had been observed, understood, and left to its routine, subtly changed but orderly, as always, in patience, civility, and quiet. Attention, the mystery had been resolved, and in that deliberate, understated manner, Inspector Purbright prepared to turn his attention to the next ordinary day, confident that Flaxborough's secrets, once subtly revealed, would inform its citizens' behaviour in ways both minor and profound.